On February of 1987, 6 colleagues from one of the first computer graphics companies founded a spiritual successor to their old workplace called Blue Sky Studios. Their first goal there was to continue their job of innovating the art and technology of computer animation with their own software they created called CGI Studio, which was like an updated version to the one they used prior called Synthavision. It took some time to get some recognition for their services, but eventually, their business grew bigger as their CG work became more prominent throughout the 1990s, from logos and TV bumpers, to commercials for major corporations, to visual effects for big-name movies and shows, starting with the 1996 MTV film Joe's Apartment. However, amongst the hundreds of jobs they've done and accolades they received during that time, the first project that presented Blue Sky's true capabilities with animation was their 1998 short, Bunny. This not only got them an Oscar, but also the confidence from 20th Century Fox that they had what it takes to produce a fully computer animated feature. Fast forwarding to 2002, that task turned into Blue Sky's first movie, Ice Age, and it went on to not only become a great success, but also the highest grossing animated feature of that year. This, along with their second film, 2005's Robots, established Blue Sky Studios as the next major animation studio, playing a significant role alongside Pixar and DreamWorks to make computer animation the medium's new standard for features. But after they proved that they could make hit movies, their next step was to take one of their films and turn it into a franchise by giving it a sequel. In 2006, the studio brought back Sid, Manny, Diego, and Scrat to the big screen with Ice Age: The Meltdown. A few years after delivering the baby to his tribe, the trio discovers that the world around them is changing. And by that, I mean that they're reaching the end of the Ice Age period as the climate is getting warmer and their valley is threatened to be completely flooded. As they make their way to a boat that is said to keep them safe when the potential flood comes, Manny discovers that he's not the only mammoth alive, as they encounter a female mammoth named Ellie. The only problem with her is that she thinks she's an opossum like her crazy but dim-witted brothers Crash and Eddie. But as they band together to go to the boat and gradually know each other, the environment around them becomes increasingly dangerous, especially when 2 sea creatures of the Mesozoic era escape their icy prison to hunt for any unsuspecting animal. And as the walls of the valley start to break apart, the trio and their new allies must escape the wrath of nature as it's adjusting to its new weather, while Manny has to learn to open up his heart if he wishes to no longer feel alone. Soon after the initial theatrical run of the first, Fox knew that they got a great new animated hit on their hands, and if they wanted to make the most out of its potential, then the team at Blue Sky had to act quick to make a follow-up, resulting them to officially start production just a few months after Ice Age's release. With the original director, Chris Wedge, already busy making Robots, Carlos Saldana was assigned to make his feature directing debut with the sequel, since he proved that he could do the job after co-directing the first and taking the helm on the short Gone Nutty, along with still assisting Chris by co-directing Robots. For the trio's second adventure, the team figured that the natural next step that the three have to face was the opposite of an ice age, where temperatures rise and all the ice that covered the Earth is melting, which can cause some serious disasters with massive floods and giant glaciers falling apart. And as the characters face those perils, they simultaneously have to come in terms with their personal conflicts in order to make the movie more emotionally engaging, such as Manny breaking through his stubbornness to solve his loneliness, Diego overcoming his fear of water, and Sid to no longer feel like he deserves respect.
This is either really good or really bad.
But to help spice up the cast for the sequel and give them a significant change, especially with Manfred, producer Lori Forte and the team created a love interest for the mammoth named Ellie, and give her a quirky twist where she believes that she is an opossum as an obstacle for Manny to deal with if he wishes to pursue a relationship with her, along with giving her two brothers who are actual opossums to provide the feature with some additional attempted comedy.
I can fly! I believe I can fly!
Keyword being attempted.
What's wrong with you?
He said he could do it.
And you listen to him.
But while it may conceptually have potential, could they be able to visually pull this off? Well, sure. Thanks to a comical sketch by Peter Desev of Ellie hanging from a tree by her tail, it gave the crew the confidence they needed that they have their new character ready. But the one whom audiences were excited to see come back was the saber-toothed squirrel Scrat. And Saldana knew that a big mission for the sequel was to make that anticipation worth it. That's why, unlike in the original, Scrat plays an essential role in the story of the Meltdown, where his acorn-chasing antics begin as the cause and later end as the solution to the feature's big conflict of the flood that threatens the valley. However, the biggest game changer for the character was at the ending when he was at the gates of heaven. It may not seem like much, but this scene was the first time that Scrat breaks out of his rodent-like demeanor and completely acts like an anthropomorphic cartoon character, unlocking new possibilities of what they could do with Scrat for the future installments of Ice Age. As the water serves as the antagonist of the feature by being the biggest threat to the characters, even more than the carnivorous sea creatures, it was also the animation team's biggest challenge of the film. Yes, there was some water in the original, but not in the levels of the Meltdown. Because of the massive amounts of water in the film, the movie has a total of 1,158 effect elements featured in 602 shots, some of which were animated by hand to give it a bit of that classic Disney style. There were also a few niche ones that were done by an off-the-shelf software called Next Limit's RealFlow, like when the valley's walls break, and the water park at the beginning with everyone splashing around. But while the team did extensive research at the Bronx Zoo and watched several movies and shows to see how they were able to pull off those effects, it was actually this one scene from The Incredibles that gave them the idea of how to animate water. When you look closely, the team at Pixar cut a lot of corners to create that shot. However, it went by quick enough where they were able to sell the effect and continue the scene. This was what inspired the crew at Blue Sky to learn that the placement of the camera is as important as the look of the effect itself, where the right angles and cuts can be as effective to make the shot work, and they don't have to capture every realistic element of the water if it's not clearly shown in front of the camera. However, the water itself was only part of the challenge. Between those few years of making the first and the second Ice Age, Blue Sky Studios was able to achieve a lot of technological advancements. Not to mention the growth that the studio had that expanded to a total of 300 employees. And the number of animators working on the Meltdown went from 35 in the first to 60. And the biggest significant upgrade they received, thanks to the production of robots, was the ability to render better looking textures like fur onto the characters. Something that they weren't fully able to do in the original. You see, in the first Ice Age, many of the mammals like the main trio and Scrat weren't covered with hair. Those were actually hundreds of cards that had hair painted onto them. But for the sequel, the team had what it takes to replace those cards with individual hairs that can interact with the elements like the wind, snow, and yes, get wet in the water. The big catch with all this was that they had to completely rebuild the recurring characters from the ground up, which was part of the task of art director Tom Cardone to maintain the visual aesthetic of the first, but also to introduce those advanced textures onto the characters and the world around them. And with the variety of hairs they could pull off, Each animal can have several different types of strands on them. Scrat, for example, has around 2 million hairs, where some, like his tail, can be long and bushy, while the ones on his face are short and stubby. On a side note, with better textures, this opened the door to include more types of animals into the world of Ice Age, including birds outside of the dodos that Peter Desev designed for the first that could finally make their debut in the second, including the diatrema, whom, if we count what's on the feathers, holds the record for having the most hairs in the film with around 10 million. If we take a step back from looking into the animation in general, because I am aware that I am turning the Meltdown into The Wonders of Water and Hair, the sequel presents a strong example of Carlos Saldana's style of directing. Compared to the first, the second Ice Age film is a lot more physical-based with its comedy, animation, and storytelling. Of course, with characters like Scrat, Sid, and Crash and Eddie, they provide the feature with a lot more slapstick comedy, but there are also some serious scenes that relied on little to no dialogue, like during the action, even choosing not to have the sea creatures talk, and when Ellie remembers her past and accepts that she is a mammoth adopted by opossums. But this also came with its own tough demands. Sid Saldana stated that the hardest scenes to get right were the close-ups with the finer details like the acting in the eyes or the position of the lighting having bigger importance. After spending just 8 months to produce the animation, the team at Blue Sky was getting ready to bring back the Ice Age, and Fox had some creative ideas with its marketing. One of them was to have the studio fully animate a Scrat cameo for the Family Guy episode Sibling Rivalry, which aired 5 days before the feature's release.
You're just a hungry little fella, aren't you? But those are my nuts! No! Oh God, no! My nuts! My nuts!
When the sequel melted into theaters on March 31st, 2006, the return of Ice Age made quite a splash. At least with audiences. Critics, on the other hand, were pretty mixed, where they weren't impressed by the story, but enjoyed the improved animation and Scrat's hilarious antics. Some also raised questions with the way the film portrayed its theme of climate change, and that its lack of answers to the cause of what's been melting the ice may undermine the fact that it's the fault of humans, even pointing towards how Fox was then owned by Republican billionaire Rupert Murdoch, and the feature having religious elements to it, like having animals pair up as couples and all go to the boat so they could be safe from the flood Noah style, could explain to the ignorance to the cause. Despite that, audiences still flooded theaters to see the movie, giving the feature a major opening weekend of $68 million, which at the time was the second biggest opening for a non-summer and non-holiday movie behind The Passion of the Christ. And throughout its theatrical run, the sequel ended up making $195.3 million domestically and a worldwide total of $667.3 million, making it the highest-grossing animated film of 2006, even though Cars and Happy Feet made more domestically. Later that year, the film came out on DVD and Blu-ray and included a Scrat short called No Time for Nuts. Directed by Chris Renault and Michael Thurmeyer, it features the squirrel traveling through time due to a time machine that he stumbled upon so that he could get his acorn and return to his period. The short was meant to be an experiment to explore more possibilities of what they could do with the character now that he's no longer limited to his rodent-like anatomy, and it went on to get Scrat an Annie Award and his second Oscar nomination. On October of 2014, a 3D version of the film was released exclusively in China, and a year later, No Time for Nuts got the 4D treatment by SimX iWorks, which included new scenes where Scrat gets chased by dinosaurs and finds himself in a modern museum. But going back to 2006, the president of 20th Century Fox Animation, Chris Meledandri, took notice how the Meltdown did better internationally than anyone could ever expect. In fact, it made more than double what the first Ice Age did at the international box office with $472 million. But how was that possible? He realized that this success was primarily from Saldana's physical-based directing, and how he used the visuals more than the dialogue for both the story and the comedy, allowing the film to quickly resonate with people from across the world, regardless of what language they spoke. That, along with the diversity in the Blue Sky team and its strong marketing and distribution plan, inspired Meledandri to use those as his principles in creating successful animated features, to which he put to great use when he left Fox a year later to join Universal and founded...
Wow! Illumination!
You know, I knew who Meledandri was before doing this animation look back, but I never expected to learn that Ice Age the Meltdown of all movies is what led us to Illumination.
He's never gonna let up on you. It'll be easier on all of us if you just go with it.
Many may argue that, as a movie, it was a downgrade to the original. However, The Meltdown was able to get the job done to turn Ice Age into a viable franchise, and then some by making it globally bigger than it was before, along with providing the trio with more possibilities of what they could do next thanks to the addition of its new characters, stronger animation, and having more creative freedom to really let out their cartoony side. As Ice Age was getting hotter, it wouldn't take long before the dawn of a new adventure with the pack emerges. But before that time came, there was another feature they had to create that gave the studio a daunting task. They had to produce a film adaptation of a children's book. And this wasn't just any book. It was from one of the most celebrated and imaginative authors in history. And that novel was Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who. It's the story of Horton, a kind-hearted elephant from the jungle of Newell who hears a voice coming from a tiny speck, which he placed on a clover to keep it safe. But upon closer inspection, he discovers that the speck contains an entire city called Whoville, and the only person who can hear Horton from within is the mayor. However, they must do what they can to protect the speck so that Whoville doesn't get destroyed by disproving the doubt from their respective communities and show them why a person's a person, no matter how small. While this is the first animated feature to adapt a Dr. Seuss book, this was far from being Horton's animation debut. In fact, there were 3 different animated adaptations of Horton Hears a Who before the Blue Sky movie. First, there was the 1970 TV special by Chuck Jones and produced by Theodore Geisel himself.
But I'll have to find them, because after all, a person's a person, no matter how small.
Then there was the 1987 Ukrainian short, My Friends, Where Are You, by Tadeusz Palvenko.
Вы живы, здоровы, целы.
And then there was the 1992 Russian short, I Can Hear You, by Alexei Karayev.
Пусть личность не больше, чем глаз муравья. Но личность есть личность. Так думаю я.
But going back to the mid-2000s, Theodore's widow, Audrey Geisel, became upset of the way that her late husband's books were being adapted to film after the catastrophic failure of 2003's The Cat in the Hat.
Awkward. Yeah.
From there, she vowed to never let anyone turn a Dr. Seuss book into a live-action feature. Moving ahead to 2005, around the time Robots was released in theaters, Chris Meledandri was able to make a 7-figure deal with Geisel in order to turn Horton Hears a Who into an animated feature, along with the option of making a possible sequel with the book's predecessor, Horton Hatches the Egg, which never happened. However, It took a lot of convincing to gain the widow's trust that they would stay true to the story as much as possible. In fact, some of the movie's key players had to come in to provide evidence of their determination, such as Mike DeFeo, the head of the modeling department, presented one of the scaled sets, and the directors, Steve Martino and Pixar animator Jimmy Hayward, remade the book with the team just for the Geisel estate that not only featured new artwork, but also added new pages with new verses between the ones from the original that expand the characters and the story.
My initial feeling was, we're going to leave the original book alone so much that we're going to show you the story with the whole original book intact. All those elements are already there.
We wanted to be able to communicate to Audrey Geisel, Dr. Seuss's widow, how we were going to take and create a major motion picture that's going to clearly be longer than that book is.
Once they got her approval, Martino and art director Tom Cardone studied the author's art style from the special collection of the University of California's Geisel Library, noticing all the unique traits that made the art distinctively Seuss, like the limited color palette, the asymmetry, and how just about everything has wrinkles to make it look whimsically organic, along with notes that Geisel was giving to Chuck Jones during the making of their TV specials, and manuscripts that he wrote for his movie, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. As for the who's who in the voices, they wanted to cast actors with strong improv skills who could strengthen both the comedy and their respective personalities, including Will Arnett, whom this was oddly his second time in a row where he voiced a sinister vulture in a Blue Sky feature, Carol Burnett, Seth Rogen, Amy Poehler, and Steve Carell, who played the mayor that was only a minor character in the book, but got promoted to be one of the film's leads. But for the voice of Horton, the team wanted to have Jim Carrey to star as the title elephant. A strange choice at first, since his style of goofball comedy is a stark contrast to Horton's kind-hearted behavior. Not to mention that it was only a few years after he starred in another movie based on a Dr. Seuss book where he was the opposite character of Horton with The Grinch. While some of his eccentric behavior did find his way into the elephant, the reason why they chose Carrey is because of his personality when he's more himself, especially when his roles in Dumb and Dumber and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind present him as a loving soul with a more positively natural attitude, which was what they wanted to capture for Horton.
You just start to listen to Jim Carrey, and we did a lot of this, listening to his movies and listen to the characters that he was creating vocally.
If you listen to his work in Eternal Sunshine, the sensitivity and the depth and warmth of just his vocal performance is amazing. And we got that warm sort of center to Horton. That sensitivity and that depth and that warmth was so present and so there. When we were listening to it, it was like, this is an obvious choice.
When it was time to visually bring the world of Dr. Seuss to life, the animators were faced with a challenge that no one dared to pull off before: to bring those pages of the book to computer animation. Sure, it was one thing to examine Geisel's sculptures to see how he interpreted his style into 3D, but it was another to do that with everything that was featured in one of his books for the purpose of making a movie. For the backgrounds of the Jungle of Newell and Whoville, while they stayed true to Seuss's familiar traits like the use of wrinkles, the limited colors, the odd shapes of the architecture, and some plants having hair instead of leaves, there was a careful balance between fantasy and reality so that those places can have some form of familiarity to the audience. To even out the whimsy, the textures are depicted realistically to show that, while the world was built in a very strange way, the materials they were made out of are something we could recognize and help identify what they are. As for the characters, safe to say that they are not the same type of creatures that you'd find in the Ice Age films. In fact, to differentiate Horton from mammoths like Manny, he frequently goes from being on 4 legs to being bipedal, where they animated him like, in their words, a fat guy in an elephant suit, along with making Horton's mouth bigger so that he could copy Jim Carrey's facial expressions.
His mouth was actually small. It was designed very small behind his trunk. That was how it was in the book. Then we got Jim Carrey. We all know Jim Carrey's elastic rubber face.
Yeah, don't I know it.
As for the Who's, the animators wanted their movements to be as wacky as Whoville itself, as if they came straight out of a 1930s cartoon. But to prepare the team for this task, the directors first presented them with character models unlike any they had seen before. They were models of some of the most over-the-top expressions they could create, which made the animators very excited, but the riggers were like,
"Holy Jesus! What is that? What the is that?"
Since their job was to create the skeletons of the CG models for the animators to move them, how the fridge could they program that amount of squash and stretch without breaking the characters, or worse, breaking the software? While it's mostly the mayor who has the most extreme poses and reactions in the film, and they were careful to not go too over the top with it by being what they call entertainingly correct, it took a lot of experimenting with the model's geometry to make a cartoon-like anatomy work. And it doesn't stop with the expressions. Many of the Who's were given 2 sets of arms with their own programming. One that could bend naturally, and another with rubber hose physics where they curve instead of bend. As for their hair, on top of completely grooming them to make their fur look like clothing, they were placed in layers so that when they do go extreme and stretch themselves out, their extra length is still as hairy as the rest of their body instead of letting it go thin and expose unwanted patches. When it came to actually animating those characters, the animators had a more fun time acting them out, often literally for references, along with watching the recordings of the voice actors. But among those who filmed themselves, the standout performer of the group who nailed the character's body language was Jeff Gabor.
Knock, knock. This is where you say, "Who's there?"
He kind of took, an approach to the scene and physically came up with something that we hadn't seen.
And now the fists are flying, and the first guy picks up a brick, and you might want to zip up the pouch for this next part. All right, fat boy, you want some of this? Lad.
While the demands were hard on the animators, they were also tough on Blue Sky's computers. Regardless if the worlds are big like the Jungle of Newell or as small as Whoville, they both have so much happening on screen with no shortcuts taken, and everything in display is a functioning CG model. The biggest example of this is when Horton watches his clover with the speck fall into a field that is completely covered with other clovers as far as the eye can see. Because there were actually millions of individually moving fluffy pink clovers, it took the systems 3 whole days just to render a single frame of that one shot. When Blue Sky reopened the pages of Dr. Seuss in theaters on March 14th, 2008, it wasn't a hit on the levels of Ice Age, but it did get an elephant-sized win. Critics made their yops heard that they had a good time with the picture and expressed a lot of love towards the script, the animation, and how it stays true to the source material, along with later receiving 5 nominations from the Annie Awards. And with audiences, they made themselves clear that they wanted to experience the first computer-animated Dr. Seuss world, as it had a solid start with a $45 million opening weekend, and went on to have a domestic total of $154.5 million and almost $298.6 million worldwide. Just when the world lost faith on the idea of turning the works of Dr. Seuss into a movie, Blue Sky Studios changed that perspective thanks to their innovative animation to show that it's not only possible to do so, but to also make it good while maintaining the spirit of the book it's based on. And from there, the film initiated a new generation of Dr. Seuss adaptations, as Meledandri and Audrey Geisel's partnership continued at Illumination, where they also produced The Lorax in 2012 and The Grinch in 2018. And this modern marriage of animation and Dr. Seuss is all thanks to an elephant who taught the world to have compassion, tolerance, and empathy with his one phrase:
"A person's a person, no matter how small."
Just like the Who's tiny speck that is shaped like a ball, some may see it as a movie that is small, But even without it being tall, its message and imagination can leave the biggest impact of them all. After they closed the book on Horton, that previously mentioned dawn for the studio's iconic trio to return was gradually emerging. But in this case, it's already here. And it only took me about, 13 minutes for me to talk about Ice Age again? Yes, a year after Horton Hears a Who, and 3 years after the second film, Blue Sky brought Ice Age back with their third feature, Dawn of the Dinosaurs. As Manny and Ellie are preparing for the arrival of their baby, the other two are faced with some growing insecurities. Diego fears that he may be losing his ferocious touch, and Sid is getting abandonment issues and wishes for a family of his own, which he tries to resolve by adopting some large eggs that he found under the ice. The big problem with his adoption is that those eggs hatched into baby Tyrannosaurs, and while Sid still wants to be their parent, the actual mother emerges to take both Sid and her children back to her home in the Lost World set underneath the surface of the Earth. And as the rest of the herd catch up to rescue their friend, they follow the lead of an eccentric dino-hunting weasel named Buck in order to find Sid and try to survive this world filled with dangerous terrain and vicious dinosaurs. When the team at Blue Sky was getting started with the production and got some training to get themselves back into the franchise with the short Surviving Sid that came out of the Horton Hears a Who DVD and Blu-ray, they decided to think outside of the box and go in a what-if direction with the story. Like, what if they encounter King Kong, or what if they discover the Shangri-La? However, considering that the Ice Age period is technically part of the prehistoric times, they realized that the answer they were looking for was to have the characters go on an adventure with dinosaurs. Wait a minute. And they got the approval of anthropologists to do whatever they want. All they asked for in return was just not to have any dinosaurs in the movie. Well, that one doesn't count. Okay, let's all agree that everything from the Lost World doesn't count either. While the crew was excited to have some fresh materials to work with on the third film, like art director Michael Knapp and Carlos Saldana, who went back in the director's chair for this, the one who was debatably the most hyped was Peter DeSev. Not only because he could experiment with many more new designs with the dinosaurs, but also, well, honestly, he was running out of animals from the Ice Age period to add to the franchise. But while DeSev and the animators were bringing to life many recognizable dinos like the Tyrannosaurus Rex, Iguanodon, Triceratops, Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Sauropod, and Pterodactyl, along with some more obscure ones taking center stage like the Guanlong and the Baryonyx, they had to apply a careful balance with how they're visually depicted between being anatomically accurate and present them as deadly threats to the herd, and look like they belong in the Ice Age universe, along with not making them too scary for younger viewers. Also, just like the sea creatures in the Meltdown, they considered having the dinosaurs talk, but they passed on it to help make the story and the character interactions more interesting.
I say they're vegetarian, you say grr. I say, can we talk about this? You say grr. I don't call that communication. See? That's your answer to everything.
However, they also took some creative liberties by depicting them as gigantic to the point of towering over the mammoths to spice up the story by placing Manny in a place where he feels small compared to the world around him.
The idea was that, Manny in the previous movies was always thought of as the biggest character on the planet, And part of the fun of this movie was that the biggest creature, woolly mammoth, was going to be encountering things which were much larger than he was.
Speaking of that world, the balance also applied to the creation of the Lost World. When the team was studying which plant life to include that could enhance the immersed feel of being in a dino-filled jungle, they also considered how to include the Ice Age aesthetic so that it doesn't feel like the characters suddenly find themselves in a completely different movie. At the same time, the Lost World came with its own set of unique challenges. Since the herd was in an area that is dominantly green instead of the white from the glaciers that usually surround them, color contrast took a bigger importance so that the characters could still stand out from their environment. As for how this jungle was even possible during the Ice Age period, they developed the world building to explain that it's like an underground greenhouse, where the Earth's core keeps the empty spots underneath the surface warm, while the ice serves as a glass ceiling where sunlight is able to enter. But within the Lost World, there is one mammal that is like a combination of Captain Ahab from Moby Dick and Tom Hanks in Castaway, who serves as the herd's guide and only hope if they wish to survive their new environment.
The name's Buck, short for Buckminster. Long for...
When creating Buck, the team considered several options of which animal he could be that could also reflect his wild nature, like a badger, a wolverine, or even another opossum that would have been related to Ellie and her brothers. Ultimately, they settled with a weasel, mostly due to the animation possibilities with his flexible body. Also, they thought about having his voice be more in the style of an adventurous swashbuckler, but after Simon Pegg was casted, he made Buck sound gruffer to emphasize how he became insane.
The first sort of incarnation was quite sort of posh and swashbuckler.
He started out being a bit more like this, sort of, hello, a bit more sort of swashbuckling matter of life and death.
But it didn't seem to fit with the character, so Simon kind of brought it down into more like a gruffer guy living off the land around him. And that fit much better with what we were going for.
Always listen to Buck.
But of course, you can't have an Ice Age movie without Scrat running amok for his acorn. For the third feature, the team decided to give his formula a little twist by adding the one thing that could possibly come between Scrat and his nut. Voiced by storyboard artist Karen Disher, who also storyboarded the Squirrels Tango scene, Scrat was created to be the opposite of Scrat, where she's a lot more composed and elegant, on top of being a flying squirrel, so that the comedy and the romance between the two can be more effective.
Her movement's really different because she's very straight with her poses. Scrat will pop and just jerk into emotion. She'll do a swirl. The uglier and the more disheveled and pathetic you get Scrat, the funnier he is. But you always have to make sure she's looking as good as possible, and that's where the comedy is, the contrast between the two.
When the Ice Age Dinosaurs roamed the theaters on July 1st, 2009, the reactions were like a much bigger version of the Meltdown, both in a good and bad way. Critics had very mixed feelings about the picture, where there were some elements they liked, like the animation, the use of 3D, and characters like Buck and Scrat, but that story did not make the movie worth their time. However, that didn't stop audiences from wanting to experience the herd's latest adventure, and they caused the film's success to be even bigger than the dinosaurs themselves. While its domestic opening weekend got interfered by Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen, how it started worldwide broke the record for the biggest global opening weekend for an animated feature by earning $218.4 million, which it held on to until Incredibles 2 surpassed it in 2018. But that wasn't the only record it achieved. Throughout its run, Ice Age Dawn of the Dinosaurs made almost $196.6 million domestically, and a worldwide total of almost $886.7 million, making it the highest-grossing animated film of 2009, the third highest-grossing movie of that year behind Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince and Avatar, the highest-grossing animated film at the international box office at the time with $690.1 million, and the highest-grossing film by Blue Sky Studios. Later on, Blue Sky released a TV Christmas special called Ice Age: A Mammoth Christmas. Directed by Karen Disher, it was about how the herd met Santa Claus. Holy crap, is that a human? I thought they went extinct after the first movie. And help him become the legend he is known today by playing a role in the origins of his workshop and getting him his flying reindeer. When it aired on November 24th, 2011, it was not only the second most watched program of its time slot at the time, But it also got an Annie Award nomination and was the most popular download on iTunes during that week. And a year later, CinemaX iWorks created a 14-minute 4D version of the feature that was presented in the San Diego Zoo, Warner Brothers Movie World in Queensland, Australia, and Chicago's Shed Aquarium. As Ice Age was becoming bigger with each movie, so was Blue Sky, as they grew into a multi-picture studio with enough artists and staff to produce several animated features simultaneously. In fact, during the making of Dawn of the Dinosaurs, Carlos Saldana was getting ready to direct a passion project that finally got the approval to be made, which was why he brought on board Michael Thurmaier to help him on the third movie as co-director. And after his job with Ice Age was finished, he was ready to bring Blue Sky to his home country of Brazil. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this second part, then make sure you hit that like button and come subscribe to my channel so that you know when the next part is coming out. As Blue Sky became bigger than ever, their next movies took them on some unexpected directions, with a trip to Rio de Janeiro, pirates breaking the ice, and William Joyce coming back in an epic way. There's still more history to look into with Blue Sky Studios, so until next time, see you later, dudes.
That's our cue. Come on, Peaches.